Before we continue, there's a big question that I want to address, which is when should you actually shoot an HDR bracketed sequence? Being honest, there's actually a lot of scenes that don't require a bracketed sequence to shoot. There's a lot of scenes that have a limited dynamic range to begin with, and as HDR denotes, it's meant for high dynamic range. Meaning if you're shooting a scene that has a limited dynamic range to begin with, then you don't need to shoot it as an HDR photograph or as a bracketed sequence. Most likely you can capture all, if not all, of the entire tonal range within one single image. Then with that one single image, we can decide whether we want to use a processing technique that we refer to as a single shot HDR, or if we just want to process it as a normal image. Either way, in these scenes that have a limited dynamic range, we don't actually need to shoot a bracketed sequence. And this limited dynamic range really has absolutely nothing to do with the overall brightness in a scene. It doesn't matter how bright a scene is. It doesn't matter how dark a scene is. What matters is the range from dark to bright. And to show you guys that, we're going to go through a few examples. Let's look at this first image from Bryce Canyon. Now in this shot, since we're shooting along with the direction of sunlight during sunset, virtually everything in our scene is roughly close to the same level of brightness. It doesn't differ by that many stops of light. Now, because of that, a single well-exposed image is generally going to contain all of the dynamic range within this shot. And we can see that within the histogram. As we can see, basically the entire range is encompassed within one photograph. This is an example of a scene that has a limited dynamic range to begin with, and shooting this as a bracketed sequence wouldn't matter one bit for this photograph. Now here's one more example. Once again, if we were to look at the histogram in this image, we can see that virtually everything in this shot fits within a relatively small dynamic range, which can be picked up with one single well-shot image. Now moving on to this next scene, this is a situation where you're absolutely going to need to shoot a bracketed sequence and shoot it as an HDR photograph. In this scene, we have an incredibly bright sky with all sorts of detail in the clouds. You have the sun shining directly through into the camera, and since we're shooting into the sun, all of our foreground objects are in dark shade. In this scene, we will need a bracketed HDR sequence to pull out all the detail from both the highlights as well as the shadows. So just remember that you don't always need to shoot bracketed sequences for your HDR photographs. There are plenty of scenes that have a limited dynamic range to begin with that can be shot within one single well-exposed image. Once you get that image into post-production, you can decide whether you want to process it as a standard image or whether you want to process what we've referred to as a single shot HDR. Now there's actually a lot of benefits to shooting your HDR images as single shot HDRs, and we're going to talk about that later on when we talk about single shot HDRs. So let's move on to the next video now.